Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Inside the Tent. So I'm here today with a good friend of mine and my former boss, actually, at one point in my career, whose name is Dave Thompson. He's retired from software now, but at one time, he was a long-standing corporate VP at Microsoft, where he led teams in Windows Server, Exchange, Office 365, and Identity. Dave was pretty well known throughout the company in terms of a man who could get things done. So I'm really pleased to have him as my guest here on Inside the Tent. So hello, Dave. It's good to see you again. It's been a little while. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, and likewise, it's great to see you, Dave.
Yeah, it has been a while. So how is retirement treating you a little bit? Tell me that, and then we're going to get into picking your brain on all sorts of career type stuff and advice you might have for my audience here.
Well, retirement, I really enjoy it. I think the thing that I enjoy is I get to do different things. I really enjoyed my career, but it was nice to meet different people and do the wide variety of things I do. I used to travel, but I do still get to interact with and work with and share with many people. So I enjoy that.
That's cool. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to ask you a little bit about your sort of the work you do now, kind of towards the end, but I want to kind of go back a little bit because you were one of those to the original days. I know Microsoft wasn't your first job. You worked for a while. You kind of came to Microsoft a little bit into your career, as I recall. So you had some work experience.
Yep.
But you were there in sort of those original days at Microsoft working on Windows NT, which I mean, I think it was just a kind of a legendary operating system within Microsoft to really change the equation in terms of like a world-class, operating system that really was a robust, incredible operating system. And so I'm just kind of curious if you could reflect back and just tell me a little bit about those original days, working on TU, guys like Dave Cutler and the other folks that created that. And, what was it like? What was great about it? What was maybe not so great? I mean, do you have fond memories?
I certainly have memories of those days. Those, I had actually, when I started Microsoft, I was hired into the Landman group, but I actually came to Microsoft because I called a buddy, Rob Short, who worked with Dave Cutler in
remember
the group. So I started Landman with a group of senior developers, and then when they basically shut down the OS2 work with IBM and turned it into Windows NT, that was a huge move. They had the fastest reorg of 300 or 400 people that I've ever seen in my life. Paul Moritz did it inside of a week and a half, and I was asked to come over and run the networking group. And that started probably one of the most rewarding times of my career. It was also probably the most intense. But so in networking, we made some interesting, simple choices. We decided that TCP/IP would be our strategic protocol. That doesn't sound like a big deal, except at the time, the Windows group, right? Windows 3, Windows 95, they were saying that it should be the Novell protocols because Novell had like 75% of the server market, right? File server market.
Yeah, big decision there.
So it was, and that, so we ended up doing some of the earliest internet work for the company, right? The first web server, and obviously the TCP/IP stack was developed in the networking group. We developed distributed systems that led us into Active Directory, so it was a very intense time. Cutler was an amazing leader. I don't know anyone else that would be able to bring something like that into being in the same way that he did, because he was deep in the code, and trusted us. I and three other folks reported to him to manage the teams. He was very demanding about the quality of work, because as you're building this operating system, the bugs can get away from you. It can be out of control. And he would basically shut features down. He sat in the build lab himself and then made us take turns sitting in, deciding what check-ins we would accept for the daily build. Okay, so that was at the time, that was the rigor that you had to apply to keep a large project like that under control. We learned a lot of lessons along the way, and but by using a process that has close to customers, we dog fooded ourselves. It turned out over my shoulder here on my wall,
Mm.
on the next to that white cabinet, is the faceplate of a domain controller from Microsoft, from the initial Active Directory deployment, where we basically changed out all the NT4 domain controllers overnight and flipped a switch, and all of a sudden
Actually, I
Microsoft.
see that. I see that right next to the filing cabinet with
That's
signatures
it.
on it, right?
And effectively, the Daytona release, 3.5 release, was one where we filled in the pieces that we knew we needed and responded to the user feedback. And each time we were more enterprise ready.
That was the one. I remember 3.5 and 4.0 being like pretty significant milestones
Yep.
in terms of like just full featuredness and quality and robustness, and something you could like really count on.
Right.
But when we really started getting to know each other and start working together was when you were starting to look at hosted services and that type of thing, which was Office. Well, at the time it was Business Productivity Online Services. Was the name we came up with. Eventually turned into Office 365. But this kind of leads me, like, I mean, there's a lot we can talk about in terms of that history. Well, actually, why don't you tell us a little bit about how that got going from your perspective? Because you were the guy kind of right at the start. You and Aaron, I guess, were probably the first two, I think.
So
Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I actually I had taken a leave from Microsoft, and they'd offered me the job if I came back to run the Exchange Group.
Mhm.
And I was excited about that. It was an opportunity to be closer to running a business. And so we ran it. We were developing the 2007 release, and Terry Myerson was actually leading most of the development work. And I spent time meeting with customers, and it became very clear to me in running the Exchange Group that the biggest problem with Exchange, which was, by the way, the league leader in crit sets, okay, the support, the highest priority escalated support calls, right? Exchange had more than any other product.
A dubious distinction there, Dave.
It's a dubious distinction, except that what I came to learn was it was really all about the customers being challenged with the complexity of running messaging service, right? In the face of the developing mobility and security and compliance and spam filtering. I mean, it was just way too complicated for them to run messaging, which should have just been a service, a simple service for them to use, right? And
it's so funny you raise that, because actually the current service that I'm working on and run now,
yeah,
it was the same thing. It was like one customer we were in, they're like, couldn't you just run this for us so we don't have to? I'm like, of course we can. And then we have to go figure out how to do that. But I mean, yeah.
Well, so that's essentially how the concept of a service was born. And we actually tried to support it, first through the unified communications group, and that didn't really take. I went to my boss at the time and said, "Hey, I think we should start an Exchange service." And he said, "No, you should go buy a spam filtering service."
Yeah.
And I was like, I really didn't have many options, but at least that got us in the service business. One of the other things that attracted me is that to services is it was really going to be so healthy for us to have to run this stuff ourselves. Jeff Rakes had this thing where you had to send him your presentation. He had to have it, I think, at least by the night before. He read it. You didn't walk through it. He came in, sat down, said, ask you questions. So he comes in the next day when Aaron and I are in this meeting, and there's a bunch of, VPs and people around the table. And Jeff looks at us and says, "I have one question for you. Tell me why we shouldn't do this." And that was it. And Office BPOS was born, right, which was the precursor to Office 365. And
the first thing I remember actually was soon after you hired me, I went out and did some customer interviews and went to like 30 customers and just interviewed them and asked them. And we sort of worked our way around to the question, what do you think if this were to be like, how's it going? What are your operations like? What do you do? And then eventually, after about 20 minutes or so, we'd be like, what if we were to be doing this for you? How would you feel about that? And they almost universally, a lot of them were Lotus Notes customers who knew they had to move to Exchange. And a lot of them were, and I was expecting them to be a little worried about their jobs, but instead they were like, oh God, no, please. I don't want to have to learn another email system. Please, you guys go ahead and run it for us. So I remember that. I also remember us thinking about how to broaden it from email to like all the workloads. So it was like more of a suite than just like a single workload.
Yep. The thing about BPOS was when we put ourselves into the service business, and our offering was limited because the product wasn't really designed for that. But we did, we forced basically forced all the different groups to adjust how they thought about their business. It was no longer a software business, that it changed how we marketed it, right? I mean, BPOS was a horrible name for a product, but it on the other hand, it basically, said, hey, there's a parallel to the server products, and it's a service, because it was just a parallel name to the existing productivity services, business productivity services. This was just the online version. Support people had to figure out how to take support calls, for services. Licensing, it changed licensing, and how we did commerce for services. Every group changed. We had to figure out how you administer this package of stuff.
A question or two for you, though, about that Office 365. So just so everyone understands, when we did business productivity online services, Dave ran this team, this organization, where we would take the server products and we would run them, like we would basically deploy them to a data center, and we built operations around it to do that. We built an administrative interface. We did, a centralized directory, and we centralized some authentication. But we were basically running the products like any hoster would.
Right.
When we went to Office 365, the model changed. And what happened was each of those core product units that ran the servers also were responsible for building a service, stack. And then we ran this central, identity and directory and experience team that sort of kind of pulled these together into sort of like a commonality, and so that they could talk to each other and work well together. I mean, it really is foundational. It's foundational for lots of things. In particular, the directory later for Azure, different story. But in doing that, you were put in this really interesting position, I always thought, and I'm really curious about your take on this, because I mean, one of what I've always seen as kind of like one of your superpowers or one of your abilities was, your ability to lead crosswise across the organization, which I think personally I always suspected or thought that was anchored in sort of like your mind, the personal integrity that you always brought to the job. I think other people saw that. But when I think back to Office 365, all those VPs, we used to do meetings where there would be like 10 VPs in the room. These were your peers, right? All in a room with you. They all had to work together. This was that time when Microsoft maybe wasn't necessarily known for being great at like working together. So how did you think about that?
I had one thing I might actually call a superpower, which I'll tell you about in a minute. But some other key factors is Steve Ballmer was 100% behind the conversion of services at that point. I talked to Steve quite a bit. I would talk to him in the Pro Club at the parking lot occasionally. He'd ask me some question about, what was going on with the services. And so that support was critical. Facing the competitive threat of Google and their services for enterprise, that was a motivator for everybody. And I had the benefit of having been at the company for a long time. And built a lot of relationships and trust. The thing you allude to, it's super important to get things done in a team or a team of VPs or in any team. for people to have trust, and trust is about, competence. Trust is about, commitment, your commitment to doing what you say, and trust is about integrity. So that was the superpower I alluded to was also that the senior executives of the company, they knew that I didn't have any axe to grind because I was going to retire. I basically extended out when I would retire. When we started the service business, it was it really re-energized me. But they knew, right? So it was like my job was just to get it done, and I didn't have any political axe to grind, right? So the idea that we started running the whole thing with BPOS, but all the while saying that everybody was going to do their own piece, right? There was no, I didn't, everybody, the senior executives knew, and I think it was clear from the way I worked, there was no territorial ambitions or anything like that. So I was just trying to do the right thing. And as I've said to somebody once, just trying to retire with dignity.
That was your main motivator, was it? What's funny about that? Actually, I also think another one of your superpowers is management. I mean, that's actually one of the main reasons I kind of wanted to get you on this call, because as a manager, I go back and I think about various people, and there's a lot of brilliant people that I've worked with over the years, and they're all generally good across multiple dimensions. I mean, you don't become a senior person at Microsoft without being, broadly good across many dimensions, but things stand out too in those individuals in unique ways. And for you, it was always management. Like, I mean, I always thought of you as being like an incredible manager, one of those people that, really knew how to motivate a team and the people working for them and like get the best out of them. And it's funny because actually my story, like you were sort of saying how, I remember you saying to me when I first came on the job, you were like, well, people say you're pretty good at starting things. Somebody said to me, oh yeah, Dave, he's pretty good at starting things, but can he finish them? I think that was your statement, being like, you're pretty good at starting things, but can you finish them? And it's just like, I was just like, damn you, Dave. Yeah, well, of course I can finish them. I'll show you I can finish them. And you're darn right I'm going to finish them. Kind of to your point of like retiring with dignity. Of course I can finish them. What do you mean?
Right.
So anyway, I was very motivated to finish it well. That proved that I could do a little bit more than just starting things. But but anyway, so stepping back, so when it comes to management, though, I mean, where did you learn, like, or well, do you view yourself that way? And I mean, like, where did you learn those skills, and kind of what were your key techniques?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I don't know if I have a super clear answer to it. I mean, I like to build. And I like to work with people. I like to build teams. I like to build things with teams. So that's, I just enjoy the process. And I think, it's probably beneficial that I'm not brilliant. Okay. If I can't understand it, I'm not going to do it. Okay. So that meant that whenever I set out to do something, I was pretty confident I understood it. I understood why we were doing it. And to me, that's one of the most important things in managing people is to be clear about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then the other thing is how you're doing it. What are your principles? You might remember, for example, as we were running BPOS, there was at one point the support team was worried about exceeding their costs. And right now, what we're about building reputation, and it's not about making money yet. We're about reputation, and we got to focus on the customers having a great experience. Support drives improvement in the product. It's so I think that having those principles and living by them constantly, in the way you make decisions and do things in meetings is important. So clarity about where you're going, and clarity about the way you're going to get there I think is important. I mentioned before that trust, that's a huge thing, with teams that you manage, as it is with, where you work cross team. Um, and then the last thing I think is it's important to be able to find satisfaction in the achievements and the growth of the people you lead.
Mm.
Because that's really, when you lead teams, that's your success, is what they can do. And that's, I don't know, I've been able to do that. I really I love working with somebody, putting them into a job, having them be successful, having the product be successful, and seeing that they've grown out of it. And,
Mm-hmm.
you feel like you've really achieved something, you've helped somebody's career.
Mm-hmm. I used to remember you would have, a few sayings you would use at various times. So I'm going to throw a few of them at you, which I thought were really good. I mean, and so I kind of, maybe you could elaborate on them and just add any that you think I might have left out. But one you were talking about a little bit earlier in the conversation was, and I think you alluded to this, you're saying, hey, things move, a certain of stuff is trust-based. An expression you called the speed of trust, how things move at the speed of trust. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that, and then I have another one for you when you're done with the speed of trust.
Okay. Well, it turns out the speed of trust, I didn't make that up. That's the name of a book by Stephen Covey Jr. In the book, what he talks about was something that, I personally experienced as well. And that is that when people trust each other, when they assume, for example, that each other have the best intentions, if somebody says something that they think is off, or they'll ask, right? Because their first assumption is there must be something they don't understand, right? When you have, we did agreements between different groups inside Microsoft, agreements between companies. When you were working with a company, for example, that you didn't trust, nothing ever happened, no matter how hard you tried.
How do you make those decisions about when to kind of, when to, and these are difficult decisions that I think people face at times. Like, I mean, there's times when you want to work and you want things to work out, but then there's other times you reach a point where you have to make decisions that maybe are going to upset some people, or but you have to move forward, and you have to kind of like work through that conflict. So how do you make that? How do you make that call, and how do you manage that?
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because it was even before I came to Microsoft that I learned early on. Sometimes you're trying to do something between two companies, was the case in that case. I won't go into the details, but I learned that sometimes it's just not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Though the people that are trying to work together are so that actually influenced the way I looked at that at Microsoft. And the first important question is, if you're working with somebody else, are their interests and your interests, are they aligned enough, and are they going to stay? Are they likely to stay aligned enough for you to be successful? And that's one important thing, because if what you're trying to do is going to be hard for the people on the other team, for example, if they're supplying you technology, if it's going to be hard for them to do that, when they're faced with their normal priorities, there's going to be trouble. They're going to be in a position that they don't want to be in. And so one of the model I settled into at Microsoft was to understand whether or not they would be aligned enough, and then moreover to insist on a model of executive agreement. In other words, the executives would have to get together and agree that they were going to do this. Not because they were any smarter than the people that were working for them, but that's the level where you could commit to reallocate resources if necessary to make something happen, right? And then the other thing was, it was important to periodically get together with the folks working on the teams and the executives, maybe quarterly, right? To understand whether or not there were things arising that was going to make it tough for them to continue to deliver to you what you need, or for you to deliver to them what they need, right? So that was, open, honest, but also regularly communicating was key to making it happen. And if they wouldn't align, it was just the wrong thing to do, right? So
And then you just have to what, forge your own path, I suppose.
yeah, well, you'd have to find something else. You'd buy a technology, you'd develop it yourself, you'd do what you needed to do. The way I used to think about it actually, and if I was in a room, whether I was running the meeting or being in the meeting, you have to have your head in two places at once. One is, you're part of the meeting, okay? And then the way I used to think about it is the second thing is sort of an out of body second perspective on what's going on in the meeting, right? And understanding why people are reacting, the way they are, what their interests are, what their feelings are at the time, right? I mean, those are, in fact, feelings are the most powerful thing in driving human behavior. There's a lot of good, there's a lot of that, but that's, it was important to have a sort of a meta view of the meeting or the situation, as well as your own perception, if you wanted to steer it productively. So,
and would you'd find yourself doing that in basically every meeting, sort of?
Well, not every single meeting.
Not every.
Some were simpler than that. Okay, but in general, I would. I mean, you sort of fall into that habit of of both. For example, and when you're sitting at the head, you're sort of trying to drive the meeting, but very much at the same time, you're trying to understand, where everybody is coming from, and and figuring out how to get the most out of the team that's in that meeting.
Is there another one that's important to call out that you thought really drove dynamics of kind of like trust and collaboration?
No, I mean, I think my father was big on integrity, and I always, he. Let me see how I would put this. He had an expression, and I didn't really appreciate it till later, till I was, in the more senior in the corporate environment. But he talked about, running for office. He said, "I never ran for office." Okay, and what I would say is I'm always just doing my job and expecting that, promotion and reward would follow accordingly if I did it well, as opposed to, watching people, whose actions were primarily oriented at driving their career, as opposed to getting the job done and being rewarded for it. To me, it was always about getting the job done.
That's a good lesson. Yeah.
I never ran for office either.
Well, it's tough, in the corporate environment. You see that happening around you, and sometimes it feels like it's an easy trap to be drawn into, I think.
Yep. But long term, it's not productive. So
yeah. And also, I guess it intersects with how you're going to look back in time on like what your working career was like. I think we've covered a lot of what I was curious about with the leadership and business and things like that. But I mean, another thing that was always very important to you, I think, when I remember when I was working for you, and I think still is, was, you've always been very involved in charitable work. And I remember you being like deeply involved with Habitat for Humanity at the time. And I know about the time you retired, you leaned heavily into the TEALS program, which is about promoting computer science in K through 12. And when we were chatting a little before this conversation, I think you mentioned some other charitable work you're doing. So I'm curious, well, how did that influence you, your career and your professional outlook, your charitable work? And like, how do you position that in your life, and what was the impact that had in sort of like a reinforcing way? And then I'm also actually kind of, what are your current sort of volunteering passions and charitable passions that you're engaged in now? Because I think this is a big part of your life still.
Yeah.
The primary part. I don't know.
Yeah, it is a big part of my life.
It was a big part too, right, Dave, at the time, even as you were working.
Yeah. So what happened? I've always been sort of volunteer oriented. I never spent very much time with any nonprofit organization until I got involved with Habitat, and I actually got involved with Habitat because my son was 16, and I decided I needed to spend some more time with him. And I went and told my boss, and I was working on Windows Server, just finishing Windows Server at the time, and I told him I need to take a month off. And I went with my son because I like to build things. My son kind of like that. I think it's natural for engineers. And we went and volunteered up at Habitat, building homes in Snoqualmie Ridge for a month in the summer, month of August. And it was great for our relationship. It was, it was a great thing to do, to emphasize in terms of community service values for him. And then I was invited in the spring to be on the board, and then I joined the board of Habitat, and that's how I got involved in nonprofits, because I really didn't have the time before that, with a family, and my job was busy. Although I'd always volunteered, whenever the opportunity arose. I really like the fancier word for volunteers, it's community engagement. I think the community is strengthened by people contributing to it. Their time, their money, but their personal time is the most valuable thing they have. And the other thing about this volunteer work is connected to me to a whole different set of people. That are fun to be with, people that have different backgrounds, people that share some of the same values. So that's been a lot of what I've done since I retired. And I've been involved a little bit with 501 with social venture partners. I joined immediately, and that's a lot of ex-Microsoft people. Social venture partners, basically, partners make a donation that gets pooled, that provides capacity to nonprofits that are trying to grow. And then the partners participate as volunteers helping those organizations. So it's a way of engaging and growing philanthropists and volunteers in the community. There's this theme of volunteering is pretty common in my work, and that connected me to another organization called Sound Discipline. That's it works with schools, and I didn't really know anything about what they did. They basically work on helping schools with training for social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices. So these are to help the whole class operate better, and kids learn how to work together. And then moreover, kids that have had tough childhoods where, the brain science shows that they are, they're bad health outcomes. And these are kids that end up in the criminal justice system. This program helps teachers learn how to help kids like that, integrate and self-regulate. And, I knew nothing about this, but the opportunity came up to volunteer. Turns out I'd read about it, that discipline that domain in the New York Times like the week before. And then I got involved with them, and I, 4 years.
Really?
Yeah. It was I thought, well, that's a sign. So I got engaged as the lead partner for them, and then I'm now on the board.
Like, one passion follows another, and these opportunities just show up, and it's just sort of like, it's a way of ongoing engagement too. That sounds good.
It is. I learn things. I have learned more about racial equity in the last 2 or 3 years because of the organizations I've been in and the opportunities to meet people that I've had. When I joined Social Venture Partners after retirement, I felt like I had, I missed the people at Microsoft. I felt like I had found my new people.
That's awesome.
Through Social Venture Partners. And some of them were former Microsoft, but not all, right? So
yeah, no, it's interesting. It's interesting, racial and social inequity, and it's I mean, for a lot of us, I think this past year has been a year where you can't look away. I mean, you have to pay attention, right? And it's great that you were seeing that before even, but it's sort of more thrust in the mainstream as a result. I think, in a way, coronavirus is maybe a blessing in disguise in terms of people's attention can't turn away to other things. I mean, they have to pay attention, and I think that's an important thing that's going on.
Yeah.
What would you say was the best career advice you ever received, and why?
Oh man, that would have been good about to think about in advance.
Yeah, sorry. In the temp puts people on the spot a little bit with these questions.
Yeah, so I can think of one example where somebody gave me some advice that I've used, and because I observed its effect in myself. So Mike Maples used to run the applications group at Microsoft, and he retired, but he was engaged as a consultant to, by the senior executives. And I don't remember exactly what he was doing, but what he did do was go around and interview a bunch of people in the company, and I was one of them. And he asked me. At the time I was running the distributed systems group in NT, and we talked, and at the end he said, "You got any questions for me?" And I said, "Well, yeah. Do you have any career advice?"
How old, Dave? Was this early in your career?
No. Well, so remember, when I came to Microsoft, I was 35, so I would have been at least 40 then. So maybe 40, or early 40s. Anyway, he said the thing he remembered, which I've used, is change is good. And coming to Microsoft was a big change for me. I'd never used a PC before, and I came to Microsoft. I had worked on VAXs doing embedded development with cross compilers and things like that. And, so it was a bit like jumping in the cold water, right? But that motivates you to do your best. Mike Maples, they institutionalized change in the office group, where they would intentionally change people's jobs. And in systems, we didn't do that as much. It was because the expertise required for a number of jobs in the operating systems much deeper, right? So it was much harder. You couldn't change people up as easily. But I have, but looking for opportunities to challenge people with new things. And myself, leaving Microsoft when I had the luxury to be able to do that, that was about doing something different. It was about change, and involving myself in these different organizations is about change and meeting different people. And I've given that. I guess that's probably the most common piece of career advice I've given when people come and say, "Should I take a new job?" And I won't mention any names, but generally, I've given that advice consistently, and when they've taken it, it's generally worked out well. And when they didn't take it, that doesn't mean they should have in that particular case. Okay, I'm not second guessing people, but there have been some great cases where people have made a change, and it's been, fantastic for them. So.
Yeah, it's one of those things that always feels a little scary, and maybe even that advice probably might have seemed like, oh, that's a little scary. But so has it played out? But it sounds like following that advice has actually worked out well.
Yeah, I mean, it's that's not always the advice. Actually, if you ask Terry, he what career advice do you think Dave gives? He would probably, because I've heard him say this. He says, "You always say change."
What does he say? Sorry, say that again.
You always tell people to change. And I think that's not quite true, but anyway. So
Cool.
Yeah.
Well,
Okay.
Dave, hey, thanks. I really appreciated it. Great conversation. Really good to see you again. I'm glad you're doing well. Stay healthy.
All right. You too, and
staying engaged in that charitable work. That's awesome. I'm glad you're doing that. It's good for everybody.
Yeah.
So,
well, it energizes me. So
yeah.
I love working with other people, but there's definitely I benefit from it. I think anybody does. So
yeah, mutually beneficial. Well, I certainly benefited working with you. I really enjoyed our time professionally. So, and I'm never afraid to tell people that, Dave Thompson, one of the greatest managers I ever had. I will tell people that.
Well,
it was some exciting times too. Worked on some big stuff together, so that was rewarding too in its own right. So.
It was, we were all so lucky to be part of all that at Microsoft. If I think of one thing about my Microsoft career, I was just incredibly lucky and fortunate to be there and to have that opportunity. Because I could have worked hard anywhere. But
and you're saying in general, or the Office 365 specifically, or just
actually,
being at Microsoft during that whole period?
During that whole period, I came to Microsoft and then I kind of fell into running the networking group in NT, which eventually meant that I ran the server group, right? And then I ran the Exchange group, which eventually meant I launched Office 365, right? So those were a matter of being in the right place at the right time, with some experience and being willing to do the work, but.
Yeah, and sometimes I think you can't predict those things. They just sort of happen,
That's why I, it's luck, that had the stock price going up in the 90s, and it's luck that, I went from working at a small company where I think we had nearly 100% of a $20 million market, and I thought I got to go mainstream. And then I came to Microsoft and I got pulled over. This too was just a piece of luck. I got pulled over to run the networking group at NT, and when we did our first developers conference, I was given a talk to 7,000 people.
That's pretty big.
That was a big jump. Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe.
And networking too at the time really. Like that was an interesting time. A lot of dynamism in the networking. I'm starting to realize, Dave, you're a little bit of an entrepreneur yourself. These have been entrepreneurial. These were sort of like, that's where a lot of the change and a lot of the growth was happening. Networking at that time,
Right. Sure.
Definitely with a host of services too.
Right. In the middle of the internet as it was happening. Right.
So. That was pretty incredible to see too. I remember that. That.
All right.
Anyway, great talking to you. You take care.
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity.
I appreciate you doing it. Thank you. We'll see you later. Take care. Bye.